So anyway, without any further ado, let me get to the topic of our talk today, which is living by the light of Christ in troubled times. And I think that anybody who lived through September 11, let alone all the things that have happened since, doesn't need to be told that we live in troubled times. One thing I would say that is interesting to me is the difference in reaction between Protestant, Roman Catholic, and what you might call Middle America, and the Orthodox Christians who are friends of mine to the events of September 11. And I think it points up something. So many Americans were surprised by the events and shocked by them, said they felt vulnerable for a first time, and so forth and so on. It kind of shocked the American sensibility that we're a special people, city set on a hill, the idea of American exceptionalism, America is a special society. And of course, if they had asked any of their Orthodox friends and neighbors about what happened on September 11, they would have been told this is par for the course. And they would have been told that on two levels. One, obviously, Islam has been attacking the West for many hundreds of years. And Orthodoxy understands this probably better than anyone else, because in the end, Islam destroyed the Byzantine Empire with the collusion of Western Christians who had sacked it in 1204. And a couple of hundred years later, it fell, having been weakened by the Crusaders. Secondly, Orthodoxy understands Islam because whether it's been in Turkey under the Ottoman Empire, or the Syrian Christians, or the Christians in Africa, the whole of North Africa, they have been subjected to the sword of Islam now for hundreds of years. And many churches, individually, whole communities, people, have been destroyed and been subjugated and marginalized by radical Islam, or to put it another way, by Islam, of which all Islam is radical. And it's only a figment of the Western imagination to think there is such a thing as moderate Islam. There are just degrees of radicalism. Because built into the Islamic Bible, if you like, the Quran, and built into the other Islamic writings and traditions, is a philosophy which, of course, you will never find in the teaching of Christ, which is the sword has to be used to conquer non-Islamic people. And there are only two positions vis-a-vis Islam, either at their feet as a conquered people or dead. There is no middle position of living with other faiths or other beliefs or other traditions. And so this is not particularly a Christian sentiment. Any Hindu could tell you the same thing. The Hindus, conservatively speaking, when Islam invaded northern India, they killed 10 million and upwards in numbers that actually dwarfed the Holocaust many, many centuries ago. And the same happened when they attacked Europe and so forth. And so for Orthodox Christians looking at the times we're in, this is not a surprise because Orthodoxy has always understood, unfortunately because it cost such a price, what militant Islam was all about. And many tens of thousands, in fact millions of Orthodox Christians have died at the Islamic hands. And so September 11 for an Orthodox Christian living in America is just the latest assault, a collision between the East and the West. And Orthodox Christians also, better than anyone, probably understand that it's nothing personal, it's just business. In the sense that these silly questions you hear on CNN and talk shows where people saying, oh, why do they hate us, as if it had anything to do with the United States of America or anything to do, for instance, with the State of Israel, shows a complete, typically American, typically Protestant, I'm afraid to say, lack of understanding of world history. As anybody will point out who studied the subject, the reason Islam today is attacking the United States is we happen to be the preeminent Western power. When Byzantines were the preeminent power, they attacked Byzantium. When Europe was the preeminent power, they attacked Venice, and then came to the gates of Vienna. When France and Spain represented the West, they attacked France and Spain and had to be thrown out in the 7th century by Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers. So if you look at just a little bit of history, you will understand that Islam has always been spread by the sword, and there has been no other way it's been spread. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at Christianity at our dark moments, such as the Crusades, or our slave trade, or if you look at the conquistadors and evangelism by the sword, or burning of heretics that Protestants and Catholics did to each other in the Western Church, fortunately, thank God, these have clearly been seen, even in the time they were happening, to be against the teaching of our scriptures. In other words, Christians were able to go to the scriptures and help to abolish the slave trade in the name of the teaching of Christ. Christians were able to look back at the conquistadors and say this was wrong based on the teachings of Christ. The unfortunate thing about Islam is that the violence and the assault on the West is not an aberration of Islamic faith. It is the heart of that faith that began with Muhammad himself, who in his lifetime took up the sword to massacre people who did not fall under his rule and would not bow the neck to his new religion. And so it is as if Christ had been a warlord, and the conquistadors and the slave traders were more faithful to his teaching than Christians who look at his teachings on loving your neighbor and turning your cheek. But the fact of the matter is, in Christ's teachings, we don't find the basis for that type of behavior. Unfortunately, at the very heart of the Islamic scriptures, you find the basis for jihad against all those who are not part of your faith. And the Islamic vision of the world is a world that has to be brought into subjugation. So Muhammad took up the sword and became a political ruler in his own day before he died. Christ was crucified for our sins and went the way of the cross and rode on a little donkey into Jerusalem and was mocked and spit at without hitting back. So that when our president tells us we all worship the same God and that this is only a manifestation of some radicals, unfortunately, either he doesn't know his history, either he hasn't read any books on the subject, or probably more likely he has to say this for reasons of politics and so forth and so on. But the truth of the matter is, as we look in these troubled times and try to live by the light of Christ, we have to realize that that light first begins with telling the truth about things. So the truth is that when Christianity behaves badly in history or today, it can clearly be seen as an aberration of the Christian scripture. When Islam picks up the sword to make converts, it is only doing what its founder did. It would be as if, for instance, when Peter took the sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ said, "Good, more power to you," and helped his disciples take other swords, and they fought one hell of a battle up there and chopped off plenty of people's heads and succeeded through violence. But instead, Christ sacrificed himself. And the reason I'm talking about this is that today, in order to live by the light of Christ, we have to also understand that the light of Christ has to illumine the truth. And the truth of our situation here in North America is not a very happy one right now. We've just entered into the beginning of a new war of religion, which is going to occupy most of our lifetimes, and probably all of them. Wars of religions usually drag on for a couple of hundred years. That was the cycle in the big Islamic attack on Western Europe, for instance, a few centuries ago, and is still continuing in the Balkans today, for instance, where it's sputtered on and off now for hundreds of years. And what we have to understand, that living by the light of Christ today is going to increasingly mean for many Christians persecution. We can see, for instance, in North Africa, Christians are being persecuted. We can see, for instance, in the Sudan, that the Christians, usually the black African Christians in the south of the country and in other places, are being killed, raped, tortured, and enslaved by militant Islam that is literally still in the middle of the slave trade, which by God's grace, people calling themselves Christians abandoned a while back and admitted was a terrible sin. So the world we now see, bizarrely enough, for those of you who are not familiar with Orthodoxy, is one that is far more familiar to the Orthodox than it would be to an American, say, out of a normal Protestant background that believes this country is sort of something special and different and specially blessed and lifted out above the normal warp and woof of historical movements. And we found that not to be the case, and September 11 was the big wake-up call. Now, the question for we who are Orthodox and those who are interested in Orthodoxy, or basically Christians, is how are we going to live in such an environment? And this, again, is where the Orthodox Church has a very great deal to teach Western Christians who are so used to being coddled and to having it all their own way. And that is that a price has to be paid for faith, the same price that the Orthodox Christians paid in the Soviet Union, a price that Americans have not been asked to pay, certainly not American Protestants. In our little brief forays into history and the world wars and so forth, we've always had this safe place to come back to. Well, it's not safe anymore. And we understand that the limit of what will be done against this country will not be governed by morals, but only by technical ability. Who amongst you thinks that if Al-Qaeda had a nuclear weapon, that would not have already been let off in one of our cities? Of course it would have been. There is no limit to what they would do to us, and there is nothing to negotiate. So that Western cultures in America now have to realize that we've run into something that even with Soviet communism we never ran into. We've run into people who believe in what they believe more firmly than we believe in what we believe. We've run into people who will carry what they believe to the logical conclusion of their presuppositions. And it's a very unequal contest in the area of ideas that was summed up by an African bishop from Nigeria, who was saying that in his community, for instance, the Saudi Arabians had built a $15 million complex, and that the Americans refused to get involved in the area because he said, when we turn to the Christian West, we find they're not Christians, and maybe they'll send us a few books, $15,000 for our center, whatever, whereas the Islamic people out of Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis that they're exporting all over the world with their imams and so forth, take what they believe very, very seriously. And so now we are coming into an age where we're going to be looking at a very basic kind of Christianity again, which is an orthodox form of Christianity, and the entertainment and the fun and games are really over. We're now going to see if the West does consider itself to be Christian. Well, its leaders certainly don't. If you look at the European community, if you look at Europe, where average church attendance for all combined Christian denominations is now slipped in most countries below 3%. If you look at the United States, where plenty of people are in church every Sunday, but most of the churches have much more resemblance to Disneyland in Las Vegas than they do to anything recognizably orthodox, where entertainment is the name of the game, where it's a kind of cheap Christianity. Standing out there in the narthex, I was talking on one foot to some folks at the table there about the Orthodox view of the sacraments vis-a-vis who takes communion, who doesn't. Or Protestants saying, well, of course, in our church, everybody can take communion. Well, of course, in Protestantism, everybody can do anything. And if you don't like a particular denomination's view of the sacraments, say marriage, marrying a homosexual couple or remarrying a divorced couple, then you just go down the street, find somebody that does, or found your own church. Or if you want to be like the Mormons, you found your own religion, because that way you can have all the nice little 12-year-old girls you want, and you go off to Utah and do your thing. And that's not facetious. That's exactly what Brigham Young and company were doing, because this is America, and we make our own reality. But now we have run up against an implacable foe that takes their religion seriously enough to slam planes full of people into buildings. We've run into an implacable foe that isn't laughing or giggling, that isn't going to Vegas for the weekend, and with whom there is nothing to negotiate. You might as well negotiate with the angel of death. We're running into a culture and a civilization that knows exactly what it wants, which is the complete destruction of Western civilization and all its values and everything it stands for, and will not stop as long as there's breath in their body. And now, all of a sudden, being a Christian will be serious for everybody, from George Bush on down. And that is, you can stand in the Washington Cathedral, you can have an imam come up and say a prayer, and you can pat everybody on the head and tell the usual humanistic lie, which is, we're all of one faith, we're all of one family, I'm okay, you're okay, the kind of stuff that flies so well on Oprah Winfrey when she has third-grade teachers all on there talking about how they love all the kids in their class, and it's all mushy and happy and all the rest of it. But the amazing thing is the United States has just run into something that by its very presence is going to give the lie to all that stuff. All the politically correct notions of a multicultural society are about to crumble in the next 10 years in this country. You're going to see it happen fast. At the next huge big terrorist event, we're going to be looking at it. The discussion won't be anymore who's checked out in airports, racial profiling, and all the rest of it. The discussion is going to be survival. And then we're going to find out what this country is made of. We're going to find out what all these people who are in church every Sunday, clapping their hands and doing cartwheels, really believe. Now, we found in the Soviet Union that the Christians, the grandmothers, the daughters, at great cost to themselves, whispered prayers to their granddaughters, and out of the ashes of the Soviet cataclysm rose the church again, the Orthodox Church. That the sacramental tradition outlasted godless communism. We found in the slave trade, in the crucified black population of the United States of America, that the Christianity that they embraced actually was a Christianity much more Christ-like and profound than what the white church embraced, because when the slave trade crumbled, the white church embraced racism, and the black church rose from the ashes of the slave trade, not embittered and vowing to kill every white man and woman and child in America, which would have been exactly what we deserved, but rather by the light of Christ and the deep religion that comes through suffering, had tremendous mercy on the population around them. And in fact, you see great creative things coming out of the black population after the suffering, both religiously but also in the area of jazz and art and in the area of scholarship and writing and the Harlem Renaissance and all the rest of it. And that was the fruit of a Christian faith in that community that had come through exposure to a Western faith rather than, say, the more ancient African faith which you find in Ethiopia and in the north with the Copts and so forth. But nevertheless, you saw the fruit of the time of testing that came out of the black population. Well, now the white population in America, stockbrokers in New York, people sitting here in Tulsa and other places, are about to find out what we're made of. Because we are now up against an implacable foe that doesn't have anything they want to negotiate about. They don't have anything they want from us. They only want one thing. They want us dead. And it's not simply Al-Qaeda. If you look at the polls that were taken by Gallup last week, 60% of the people living in the countries they polled in the Muslim world will not even yet admit that Muslims were involved in this attack, and they're blaming the CIA or the Jews or the American government or whatever else you want to name. And so you're not dealing with people who are looking even honestly at what occurred. And it has been hard to hide from the world, even though there's been every attempt made, the rejoicing in the streets of the general populations in Islamic countries at every evil that befalls this country at every instance. If you think about hate crimes, for instance, of which we've had some in this country, like the one against Matthew Shepard in Laramie, where he was crucified on a fence because he was a homosexual and killed by some bigots and horrible people behaving in a very, very horribly un-Christian way. If you look at the execution of Pearl, who was the journalist the other day, before they cut his throat and then chopped his head off, they made him say, "I am a Jew, and my father was a Jew." And then they killed him. It could have been something lifted right out of Buchenwald or Auschwitz. And that's the resonance that it had. So what we're dealing with, and incidentally the person who masterminded that or was alleged to, is a PhD graduate of the London School of Economics born in Britain. So it has nothing to do with the poor people of the world rising up against the rich West. It's simply Islamic hatred of all that is non-Islamic, pure and simple, mainly by educated people who have been to our own universities. In the case of the hijackers, wealthy Saudi Arabians and others trained in the ways of their faith. Now, we, big, soft, pliant, friendly America, who tend to sweep our own history under the rug, whether it's the abortion trade or the slave trade or the rise of the eugenics movement or racism and these other things we have not confronted, let alone the rest of the world, are now up against people who are not as smart as the Soviets were, in this sense that the Soviets always played our game, as did the North Vietnamese, for instance, when they were using people like Jane Fonda, who were essentially traitors to their own country and to the cause of the West, would use them cleverly. But these foes are too implacable even for that level of cleverness. They simply want us dead. And now the U.S. is in a position where Christians in this country are going to be looking at their faith, saying, what do we really stand for and what do we really believe? I'm reminded of the scene in the brilliant film, one of my favorite movies of all time, which is Being There, studying that you remember was made, in the early 1980s, where Peter Sellers is in the film, and it's the first time he's gone out into the light of day, having lived this reclusive life as a butler, gardener type person in this wealthy person's home. And some gang members on the street come up to him, and he doesn't like what he's seeing. And at home, his whole exposure to reality was TV. And he watched TV a lot, and what he was carrying with him was a remote control in his pocket that he happened to walk out of the house with. And when this gang member pulls a knife on him, he pulls his remote out and clicks it as if he's trying to change the channel. But the fact of the matter is, you can change the channel, but when you go down to New York, there really is a big 6-story pit where 2 buildings were and over 3,000 people died. And there's no clicking it away. And you have to understand that the only reason the whole city's not gone is because they didn't have a nuclear weapon. And the only reason we're not all dead of anthrax is they haven't figured out how to mill it yet in sufficient numbers. And the only reason that it hasn't happened yet is that the statistical probability hasn't occurred. But the fact of the matter is, and I hope I'm not prophetically correct here, we've only scratched the surface. We're going to see in the next 10 and 15 years things developing which I think will make the beginning of this whole thing look like a picnic. Very much as the phony war did in the Second World War, when nothing was happening after the declaration of war, and Hitler had invaded Poland, and for about 6 months it just seemed as if things were going to go along, and the war proper would never get started. And I think we're in that same position. Now, I think we happen to have a president who understands this. Whatever he says about Islam, or has to say about Islam, I think he understands that it's a long haul, and I think he's preparing for a very, very grave and long war. Fought on many, many fronts. But it's not clear to me that we in the United States and we Christians in this country have any kind of a spiritual sense outside of the Orthodox Church, which has been here before, tragically, many too many times, not only with Muslims, but with the communists and others. Outside of the Orthodox Church here in this country, it doesn't seem to me that most people in America are spiritually prepared. On the politically correct side, you have a national elite in our chattering classes, so-called, who tend to not take any religion seriously. So for them, it's all the same. They all sort of worship some god. It doesn't really matter. What they do is read the editorial page of the New York Times for their divine revelation, and the rest doesn't exactly matter. And then you have a secularized group of people who are nominally Christian. But you notice they would not be calling to, for instance, save the Christians in southern states of places like Nigeria, or go to war on behalf of their fellow Christians in the Sudan. Even though the little finger of American power could save all those people, we would never go to war to save our people, our Christians, in Africa, for instance, the way Islamic people would go to war to fight for their own today. And so we show that broad, easy, slothful American middle class may call itself nominally Christian on its baptismal papers, but has no sense whatsoever that it is in some kind of real confrontation with an ideology that will take it down. And then you have a more Christian group, fundamentalists, Protestants, charismatics, and others, and so forth, who may have some deep personal commitment to Christ, but because they have rejected their connection to the historic church, because they call themselves Christian, this sort of thing generically, and do not tie back into the roots of any kind of Christian experience that connects the dots up the way these icons in this church do, generation to generation, there's no sense of shared experience or wisdom in how you confront suffering, persecution, and evil, and so forth. And so really it's like orphans without a leader. They're just waiting for something to happen, and it's all new to them. Why do they hate us? How could this happen? If they only understood us better, they would like us. This sort of thing that shows a naivete that is more frightening, really, than what the terrorists have done, because it means that we are totally living in la-la land. This is really Chauncey Gardiner in being there, clicking his remote, trying to make it all go away. And it has no reference at all to the reality of the situation. And then there's a small core of people in the Orthodox Church, people who have survived persecution in the Soviet Union, of the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, others who have a collective memory of what it really is to be a people on a confrontation with another viewpoint that is implacable. And they remember that the Turks, the Jansenaries, would make the Greek families pay the blood tax. Out of every generation, they would take one male child, steal them away when they were about 3, raise them in Islam, and bring them back as Jansenaries, which were the most feared troops of the Ottoman Empire. They would brainwash them, and of course the Soviets did the same thing, taking people off to youth camps and so forth. And they have a kind of institutional memory of what really happens when you're under the thumb of Islam. Most of America, though, would not, and has a very kind of romantic notion of the fact that somehow if we all understood each other better, this wouldn't happen. But of course the lie is given by the fact that the people who are trying to kill us, the gentleman who organized Daniel Pearl getting his throat cut after he was made to say, "I am a Jew and my father was a Jew," is a person born in Britain who went to the London School of Economics and got a PhD. This is not someone of whom it could be said, oh, if they only understood us, they would love us. Islam has come to the West, looked around, hates us more than ever. And their most educated people hate us most of all and are the most implacable of our foes. So we're in real trouble. We're in real trouble on that front. So in terms of living by the light of Christ in troubled times, I think the first thing we have to recognize is the truth of our situation. Our situation is not dire in the sense that this culture is not about to crumble. We live in a very powerful nation. But it is dire in the sense that there are a lot of people in this culture who are telling themselves lies and who are not speaking the truth or bearing witness to it. Look at the situation. We have African Americans in this culture who are looking to Islam for a resolution of their problems, and this has been brought upon us by the fact that white Christians have treated African Americans so badly in our history that it is natural that they would look elsewhere. The tragedy is what they're looking at is the religion that has oppressed more black Africans than the West put together, and continues to do so. The active slave trade in the Islamic countries is going on today as vigorously as ever. So there's a tremendous irony in that. Then you have your American Christians who have bought this politically correct, pluralistic, multicultural line that somehow we all worship the same God, and that if we could just understand each other through ecumenical dialogue or whatever it would be, we would all get on. Or you have the Islamicists in our universities who teach it as an academic subject, who like to talk about the high level of Islamic culture in Spain when the Islamic people were ruling there. Before the 7th century, this type of thing, the golden age of their scientific explorations when they invented numbers or numerology or this kind of thing, but who refused to deal with the reality of the situation. And then you have Christians living in this country who believe that their spirituality begins and ends with feeling good, how they are stroked in their churches, whether people are being nice to them, the kind of relationships they have, this kind of Oprah Winfrey syndrome of American Christianity. And I would say if you put all this up against the movement of Islam through history, not in a military sense, but in a moral sense, we're in real jeopardy. We're not going to lose wars, but it's a very, very different thing to have the resolution to continue for a long time. And when one looks out into the future and realizes the kind of weapons of destruction that are now in the hands of the people who have been trying to destroy the rest now for the better part of 13 centuries, it is a new day in that regard. And typically, as happened with the Turks and the Greeks, the Islamic countries very unable to produce anything of their own in the way of technology. The philosophical system is so limited and fatalistic that it does not produce science. They have very brilliant people, as smart as anybody in the West, but the philosophical system itself is a closed book. And so you may have one inventor here or another inventor there, but it doesn't lead to very much in the end because of the sense of the society that comes out of their ideas. But they've been quite good at borrowing warlike and lethal technology. And so, the Turks eventually learned how to use some of the weaponry the Byzantines had against them. And the same has been true in our own day and age when they fly Boeing jets into buildings and when they're trying to steal nuclear weapons and this sort of thing. Who would have thought when we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima that the next city to be nuked in the world would probably be an American city within the lifetime of many people, which probably will come to pass. Sadly, just because of the statistics of how much nuclear material is wandering around out there. Unfortunately, within our lifetimes, I think we'll see this. And who would have thought that the technology of the West its most lethal application would be by people who would not go into an arms race with it, but simply pilfer enough to if not bring us to our knees, certainly hammer us very hard between the eyes and change the course of history. But that's what we're looking at. So what does it mean to live by the light of Christ in the midst of this? Well, I think from the Orthodox perspective, it means that we need to, first of all, tell ourselves and other people the truth about what we're facing in this situation. And secondly, it means that we need to get our spiritual house in order. And those of you who are Protestants have to look at what Protestantism has produced in this country in terms of the hedonism, in terms of the paganism, in terms of the loss of faith, even while religion itself is big business. We need to look honestly at the European Reformation countries, which are now the most secularized countries on earth, places like Germany and Holland, out of which the Reformation came. We have to extrapolate our 23,000 denominations down the road by, say, half a century and be honest enough to say when it's 123,000, when the weirdness of much of our Protestant movements, whether it's Pentecostalism, speaking in tongues, the kind of thing here in Tulsa with ORU, the sort of things that are being preached by our televangelists, when this is extrapolated out another 3 generations, what will separate us from the mystery religions and the cults of ancient Rome? And this, unfortunately, is a hard saying, but it's the truth. We're on a path that every generation passes down a weaker faith. So in my lifetime, and I'm not that old, I hope, I've seen us go from a time when evangelicals would never have pastors who were divorced and remarried. That's changed. I've seen a time when divorce itself was seen as outside Christian behavior. That's changed. The divorce rate in so-called evangelical groups is about 50%, same for the rest of the country. We've seen all kinds of shifts on the sanctity of human life and cloning and all the rest of it. And the fact of the matter is, Protestantism has showed itself not to be the answer to secularism, but the source of it. And I say that with great sobriety and I hope compassion for people who are in the Protestant community. Because the fact of the matter is, the relativistic vision of the future that's in the West today started with Protestant theologians. When you no longer have a tradition that you subscribe to, and you're no longer part of the same church, and you're free to go start your own denominations, and you're free to get rid of this sacrament and keep this sacrament and change this and change that, essentially what you've done is you have opened the door to the kind of liberal secularism that we have. Or to put it another way, when you no longer need the church and tradition, it's just sola scriptura, pretty soon a generation that comes along and says, well, why even sola scriptura? How about just sola, alone, me, myself, and I? And that's where we've seen it go. And that's where the whole Protestant movement is going. And so let's understand one thing out of this talk, if nothing else, and that is history is not static. History is not static. So it's not going to forever be Protestant denominations, Orthodoxy, the Roman Catholic Church, as if it's static. Just take Italy as an example of what I'm talking about. If you think history is static, compare my vision of Italy in my novel Portofino, which is this work of humor I wrote. You wouldn't think listening to this lecture I actually write works of humor for a living, would you? But I do. But if you look at the vision of Portofino, one of the things that Calvin Becker, who goes down to Portofino as an 11-year-old, loves is these huge Italian families on the beach that he gets to play with as this American kid. Well, the fact of the matter is, I wrote that novel to take place, Portofino all takes place in the mid-1960s. Well, in the mid-1960s, when I was as a child going to Italy, there were huge families on the beach. Roman Catholics and big families went together. In Italy, there were lots of families. They all had a lot of kids, 5 kids, 8 kids, running around, cousins and aunts. They loved children. The piazzas, squares were open in the evening. Everybody put on their kids. They dressed up in good clothes. They ran around until midnight. And one of the great things about Italy was this tremendous welcoming family atmosphere where children were not only sort of indulged and enjoyed, but were really part of the fabric of life, like other Mediterranean countries. Greece was the same, and so forth and so on. Well, in a couple of generations, again, I'm not that old, the difference between me at 12, which is the vision of Calvin and Portofino, and me now, isn't that big a gap of history. Italy now has the lowest birth rate in Europe, and they've fallen below replacement level. The average size of an Italian family is 1.3 children. They're down now below even replacement. There are whole villages in Italy which are literally turning into ghost towns in which the average age is 65 and 70 years old. There are now more pensioners in Italy than there are people in school. And the balance is tipping to the point where Italy literally is going to be unable to meet its budgets within the next 10 years. The largest economic crisis looming in Europe right now is demographic. Europe, having first lost its faith, has now lost even its will to breed, literally. And so you see sliding birth rates in Europe to the point where, for instance, my daughter who lives in Finland, the government there, which was the first government in Western Europe to legalize abortion, now has turned around, and abortion's still legal, but they pay women 80% of their last paycheck for 3 years after they have a child, asking them to stay home with that baby, literally trying to bribe people in Finland to have children and make it easier for them because they literally look at the picture demographically and will not be able to support themselves. So it's not only gone from a loss of faith, it's a loss of faith that now equals a loss of population. It's where materialistic vision of the world and greed have come to the point where literally people would rather have a car or a 2-job income or whatever it may be than even one child, where even bearing children is seen as an inconvenience. We're not quite there yet in the United States with our 45-year-old moms who first have their career and then wait to have that one child if they can find an egg or something that still works. But we're sliding in that direction. Europe is already there, and that's where the West is going. So when you go to Italy, and you see, for instance, that about 10% of their population is Islamic now, 15% in France, climbing up in Britain, close to 10, same in Germany. There are reasons for this which are truly, you almost hear sort of the echoes of the apocalyptic horseman in the sense of a civilization. I'm not talking about the return of Christ. First of all, you have a culture that has a loss of faith. The Western church has imploded, literally, in Western Europe. The Western church has imploded. The Reformation took everything down with it, finally. There's been a complete loss of faith. The Catholics have outdone the Protestants. So the Protestant rot, as it were, of each man going in his own direction and to hell with tradition, has now infected European Catholicism to the point where where Italy is not having children. Talk about a reversal of fortunes. And now you're looking around Europe and you have a declining population, and the only people who are willing to come in and work are the waves of immigration into Europe, which just happen to be about 90% Islamic now. And when you look at these forces, you realize that to be a Christian, living by the light of Christ in today's world and into the future where we and our children will soon be living, is not in any sense a static picture. We are no longer in the West as it was once understood. We are in a culture facing a religious war, but ironically, we seem to be the last people to understand that we're in a war, and we sit there thinking, oh no, we're just fighting terrorist activities, and these are police actions. Well, these terrorist activities, quote unquote, if you look at a world map, just happen to link up like hot spots on a tectonic plate, like volcanoes, starting in the Balkans, running all the way out to Indonesia. And everywhere that Islam is rubbing up against other cultures, there are wars, civil wars, bloody actions from Kashmir to the Balkans, and from Kashmir in the other direction out to Indonesia, and now encompassing in the West. And if you look at the demographics of Western Europe is either going to have to sit there unable to pay its pensions or import workers, because one thing they're not doing is having babies, because the loss of faith has lost even to the will to breed in a way. And so what you have here is a vacuum that is being formed, that is being ready to be filled. And so there is a very, very, very good possibility that within the lifetimes of most people here my age, and very certainly within the lifetimes of you who are younger, you will be looking at a world that no longer resembles the world you're in now or were raised in, any more than someone who was living in Weimar, Germany, looked back pre-World War I and had a world that represented the world they lived in. And the world that is coming is one in which the only Christianity, I think, that is going to mean much is the basic sacramental form that has survived the onslaught before, the onslaught of communism, the onslaught of Islam. That sacramental form, which is not related to being entertained or feeling good, but is a very strict path of ascetic struggle toward Christ through the sacramental tradition, is the one that will last again. As a Christian, we know it will last because Christ said the gates of hell will not prevail against this church, and it never has. The gates of hell have certainly prevailed against thousands of Christian offshoots that have bled away from the basic Christian faith, but not against the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is the Orthodox Church, which has continued on that path. And it has stood the test of time, we have seen again and again. In our own culture, therefore, I think what it means to be a Christian now, living by the light of Christ, often would be interpreted in a spiritual, sort of touchy-feely manner. But in fact, I think we're now living in an age when it has to also be looked at in a historical manner. And that is, what does it mean to be willing to stand up for your faith against, for instance, the Islamic horde that is literally at our gates again? What does it mean to be in a culture that is simultaneously religious but also thoroughly pagan, in which you have Billy Graham at one end of the spectrum, if you like, and you have Las Vegas and the Disney Corporation at the other end, and all points in between? What does America stand for? Does it stand for putting a McDonald's in every town of the world? Or does it stand for certain truths that we hold these truths to be right and inalienable? Is America the center of the abortion industry and the future genetic engineering and cloning industry? Or is it the center of light and freedom and truth that it prides itself on? When we send our troops overseas to defend the American way of life, what are they defending? Are they defending the Constitution of the United States, this enlightened document that comes out of a Christian background, and also the Enlightenment background and the Greek background, pre-Christian background that has given us this great freedom in this country? Or are we just defending our commercial rights worldwide to pump more oil and drive behemoth SUVs that get a mile to the gallon while we put our Greenpeace stickers on the back of them? This country is going to have to decide what it's about. We're about to have a mirror shoved in our face. There's been nothing like this in American culture ever. Even in the Second World War, 3,000 civilians never died in any bombing attack. We weren't London under the Blitz. And so I think that we who are Christians trying to live by the light of Christ in this time had better stop looking at our contemporary leaders for guidance and begin to look at the saints of the church who survived and lived through exactly the same times. Now is the time to read the Church Fathers and to find out what it was like to live in the declining Roman Empire. Now is the time to find out what the saints and the fathers of the Orthodox Church did under the Turks and the Ottomans. Now is the time not for us to send missionaries to Russia, but rather to ask the Russians who survived the Soviet onslaught how they kept their faith after they had seen their priest crucified on a church door, after they had had their child shot because they taught her a prayer. Now is the time for us to look at what it means to have a steadfast military resistance based on the idea of a freedom that is worth defending by force of arms, through the American military, steadfastly, not a la Bill Clinton, when in the Black Hawk Down incident, a number of people were killed, and the next day we book it out of there, thereby sending the signal to Al-Qaeda and others that if you hit them, they will run, which is exactly what the Clinton administration did, which is largely responsible, I believe, for the cataclysm that followed and our weakness. But now is the time to realize that there will come a day in the not-too-distant future, the way this thing is playing out, when we will not be able to have the names and up-close and personal stories of every American serviceman or servicewoman killed, because their numbers are going to go into the thousands again, as they did in the world wars. It's not going to simply be a police action here and a few cruise missiles there. We are really up against it. And this thing is going to unfold slowly and gradually and in a very deadly way, I think. Because the numbers are there. There are just too many people out there who have been trained as killers and who are after us now. And so when you look at the situation, what does it mean to live by the light of Christ? Well, one thing it means is to tell the truth. To tell the truth about Christian faith. To tell the truth about the sacramental tradition. To tell the truth about the fact that the church has survived times like these before. To tell the truth to our American brothers and sisters in the Protestant easy-go-lucky churches that the game is over. That their forms of worship and their churches may look more like entertainment than they do Christianity, but this form of Christianity is going to be swept away by two forces, outside forces, but also internally. That at a certain point, the trivialization of worship and liturgy and all these other things simply will mean that Christianity as such will completely evaporate. I was mentioning to someone before this talk that often when I talk to Protestants, the level of ignorance about what historical Christianity actually is now is so high with each succeeding generation that it really reminds me of taking my grandchildren through the attic where I grew up in Switzerland, and they have no actual relevant memories to the bric-a-brac and the pieces. I know what this was. Oh yeah, this is the jug grandmother used to use, and here this is one of my father's favorite books. To them, this is just something lying up there, and it's a book, and if they see the name in the front of it, they might know something about it. And then their children are going to have, this will just be anything to them. Like a family photo album, when you look through someone else's photos, all those preciously kept photographs. If you didn't know the people, they don't mean anything to you. It's just pictures. And they get tossed and you see them in a yard sale and your heart breaks because you think this once meant something to someone. Well, similarly, the Christian tradition is evaporating before our eyes. Standing in the narthex, I was talking to a couple who are here about this and getting a question that I get all the time. Why don't Orthodox have everybody take communion and so forth and so on? But as I was trying to explain then, it has nothing to do with excluding anybody. The Orthodox Church hasn't excluded anyone. It's never changed. It never let people outside the church take communion. Back in the first centuries of the church, long before there were any, quote, denominational splits, it's the world around that has changed. I'm reminded of the children in the attic, looking at the bits and pieces. Oh, sacrament, doesn't that mean communion? That's kind of the only sacrament we have. We got this, and this is how we do it. And what's that? And then the next generation comes along, as many Protestant groups have, and there isn't even communion. It's all home Bible churches with nobody serving anything. And what do they do now? Oh, well, we have an agape meal. We sit down on Saturday, and that's sort of like communion. We break bread and ask Jesus to bless it. And then the next generation. And the whole sacramental path of accountability that lets you live the kind of life that resists Soviet communism, that is willing to send men to die in fighting militant Islam to defend our freedom, evaporates. Because with the traditions, with these family photographs, with these portraits, going out the window to generations of people who call themselves Christians but do not even know what the basic sacraments of the church are, you get to the same position that we have today in America, where we have a general lack of knowledge of history, even of our own history, where I see a news story today on CNN where they're interviewing a general who was a Marine in the Second World War, who got stopped the other day at a security checkpoint, and they wanted to confiscate his Congressional Medal of Honor he had in his pocket. And the person looking at it didn't even know what a Congressional Medal of Honor was. And so you say to yourself, here we have the ultimate irony. We have somebody with a Congressional Medal of Honor, and it's being taken away as a sharp object by someone that doesn't even know what a Congressional Medal of Honor is, and you really just start sensing that a culture that has cut itself off from its history, cut itself off from its roots, cut itself off from real education in the name of all this psychobabble stuff of high self-esteem for no reason, which is also the reason people do not learn to read. Because self-esteem is not the first thing you want a child to learn. What you want them to learn is to obey you and to have some discipline and to get the job done. And they don't need a TV set on every desk. What they need is a teacher who will watch out for them and parents who are involved with their life. And all these little tricks and toys we've used to pretend everything's fine when it isn't. As if computers and gadgetry and all these things can solve problems, when what people need is totally different things. And the way we use Ritalin for so-called behavior problems, when behavior problems are the problems of the parents. They're the ones who should be taking the Ritalin for getting divorced and dumping their kids and being bad parents. They're the ones who should be drugged into a stupor, not their little boy who's fidgety because he doesn't have a real mother and a real father who will discipline him and give him structure. All these games America has played now go up in smoke in the World Trade Towers. And as those towers collapse, therapeutic nonsense collapses with it, because this is no longer a world in which Ritalin or more psychobabble or self-esteem will cut any slack. Osama bin Laden doesn't care what your self-image is. He's going to kill you either way. And that's the world we're moving into. And this country has lived in a fool's paradise. The world has never been the soft, pliable, silly place that we pretend it is. And we have swept the evils of abortion under the rug. We've swept the evils of the slave trade under the rug. We've swept the evils of racism under the rug. Well, this is one that ain't going to go away. It's coming back, and it's coming back with a vengeance. And what is going to happen is we are going to, having denied we're a Christian country because we say we're pluralistic, so we're open to everyone, we are going to be forced to decide whether we're a Christian country or not. And this country is about to have to make some very hard decisions. And the irony is that we're being forced to actually make some decisions that may be good for the moral fabric of this country by people who wish us ill. And God's blessing and mercy will ride on the fact of whether we're going to learn from any of this or whether it's all too late. And that I can't answer. But that we are going to have to learn something is very evident to me. Because a computer on every desk and Bill Clinton feeling our pain and Oprah Winfrey telling us that all we have to do is shed a few tears and be kind of therapeutically involved with our families, Ritalin for the kids in school, all this stuff ain't going to cut it. And the people who understand the future best, I think, and this may sound weird, but as I mentioned this morning with a son in the Marine Corps, are the drill instructors on Paris Island and in San Diego, and some of the Orthodox monks I've met. And I'm not being facetious, because both see a hard world in which discipline, obedience, and doing things the way they should be done is the only alternative to getting killed. Both see a world in which you can't be selfish, that the most important person is the Marine standing next to you, they tell you on Paris Island. And that's exactly what the monks on Mount Athos will tell you as well, that it's the opposite of high self-esteem. It has to do with humility and obedience. And so essentially when you look into the future of this country and where we're going and what it means to walk by the light of Christ, it is not going to be what you all expect. It is not another sermon on loving your neighbor. It is not sitting down and talking about feeling your pain. It is not more psychobabble and women's and men's Bible studies and little clubby things we do. It is something completely different. It resembles Mount Athos and the ascetic fast leading up to Lent, and it resembles Paris Island and San Diego for the Marines much more than it resembles what you think of as church and spirituality. Because most of us think of church and spirituality as sort of a touchy-feely, feminized, I don't mean feminist, but feminized in a bad sense, not womanly in a good sense, feminized experience with no hard edges. And to cut to the chase in this sense that Orthodox will understand, it's the difference between Byzantine chant and American la-la-la-la choir music.